So we're in a series called The Surprising Christ, mostly in Luke. And these words that you heard Jorge read, and by the way, they're in the back of your liturgy that you received if you want to follow along with that, would have been indeed quite surprising to his disciples. These words that let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as the one who serves. Now, there were prophecies in the Old Testament of a suffering servant, an anointed one who would come. But that notion had faded in the minds of most Jews. They anticipated the one that was going to come and establish, rule, and banish the foreign oppressors would not come in the image of a servant. No, they had an imperial mindset. This leader would be quite obviously kingly, quite like the Caesars they knew, except, well, better than those. So the framing of greatness in God's kingdom as that like a servant would have felt upside down to the disciples. Now, for those of us who live in the 21st century, so much have Jesus' words 2,000 years ago and the Christian worldview saturated Western culture that this no longer surprises us. And that's great. Jesus changed the world. He changed the ethical ideals such that the notion of service is an ideal, no matter what faith you come from. Jesus did that. It's no longer a surprising ideal to us. For instance, we even call those who work in government public servants, which for Romans would have been an oxymoron or oxymoron. It wouldn't make sense, a public servant. But it does to us because of Jesus. But maybe this language of servanthood sometimes does get eclipsed in our contemporary culture. I remember years ago when I was in my 20s, a young woman had some of us over for dinner, and she was continually up and down, refilling glasses, refilling plates. And at some point, meant as a compliment, I said, "You are being such a servant to us." At which she replied, "I am not a servant." Having taken this to mean that she was more of a waitress than host or benefactor. So I thought we'd belong to the same linguistic community, but apparently not. But something like that kind of shock would have been probably present to the disciples. Jesus uses the word for servant. It's diakonos in Greek, from which we get our word deacon. So in the ancient world, to be a diakonos was not to be a free person. The servant was indeed, in that context, someone who waited on others, like a waiter or waitress or a butler. Even our contemporary notion of the waiter and waitress, many of us have served as such in our lives, I suspect, including myself. Even our contemporary notions of waiter and waitress carries much more dignity now than it did then. To be a servant then was synonymous with being a slave, essentially. It was the humblest position in society. So here's Jesus now telling them that someone who behaves like a servant to others, well, that's greatness. Now, I haven't been a Christian, I haven't been a church pastor for most of my life. I have been a Christian for most of my life. I haven't been a church pastor for most of my life. And for much of that time, I would look at the pastorate and think, that is a humbling job, which is probably why I didn't want to do it. I remember a well-known pastor in the area just a few weeks ago when we were meeting, some pastors were meeting together, lamenting, "Remember when it was cool to be a pastor?" And I thought, when was that? No, it's a humbling job. And that, of course, is the surprising thing about Jesus as a rabbi then that would have been confusing for his disciples. He would humble himself to the point of embarrassment to the people associated with him. It was embarrassing the way that he would assume a kind of servant's posture with people, tending to the sick. Remember, doctors were still kind of hired hands. Feeding others, reaching out to children, and even letting those of ill repute serve him. We think of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. We think of the woman of ill repute in Simon's house. He humbled himself, even humiliated himself for their sake. We heard in the passage that Doug read from 1 Corinthians, where Paul is speaking and saying, we are reviled as apostles. We are persecuted. We're slandered. We have become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. That language might make us wince a little. And of course, Paul, in another place, explicitly identifies Jesus as a lowly servant, quoting what was probably a Christian hymn at the time in Philippians 2, that Christ, being in very nature God, didn't consider equality with God something he had to demonstrate in some imperial way. No, he made himself, says Paul, nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. And so while you and I now, by this point in world history, are pretty familiar with the ideal of serving others in theory, in practice, the life of serving others is indeed still humbling, chiefly because it is not one by which we seek to make a name for ourselves, to elevate ourselves above others, to answer the question, how will I become great in the eyes of others? I would say the call to move among people as a kind of servant actually goes right against the grain of human nature. See, what comes naturally to us, or at least to me, is a certain craving for honor, for admiration, for superiority, to excel over others, motivated, of course, by my insecurity and fear. I remember hearing years ago during the glory days of the Lakers, somebody on the radio about how Magic Johnson had walked into an LA restaurant, I think after they'd done the three-peat championship, and everybody in the restaurant just stood up and applauded him. And I thought, I want that. The classical term for this sin is vainglory. You and I, by the way, are designed to receive glory, but it's through our friendship with Jesus. But vainglory, the word vain just means empty. And we can turn everything toward this pursuit of vainglory. It's not just confined to the things we might think of, the obvious tournaments of popularity in politics or wealth or media. There's many ways by which we seek to distinguish ourselves from others, not the least of which, frankly, is in ministry. Making a name for oneself in ministry is a huge temptation for pastors. And Jesus knows that the desire for vainglory is not some kind of little private, precious, kind of purification. He knows that the pursuit of vainglory actually spills out to hurt others. For we know vainglory is achieved and fed through comparison with others, through trying to appear better than others, through competition, unhealthy competition, and a host of other means which makes for a divided, miserable world that we call the rat race. It's the desire to be regarded in a way that eclipses others. And indeed, that's the word used in this passage. If you look at the passage, verse 24, a dispute rose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. Jesus comes upon them as they're talking about this. Now, our English word regard comes from the French word regarder, to look or watch. And in this context, it means they were arguing about who would be seen as, who would be looked upon as the greatest in terms of image. And isn't it true that not a lot has changed? We live in an age of regarder, of regard, in which what it means to be human is to be on display. We only know if we're somebody or something if people see us on display. And we have the technology to make that work. Now, this is not to say that we should not receive and enjoy recognition and honor when it comes, especially if it accurately reflects our contributions. Indeed, we want to do well, and we need our achievements to be confirmed, sometimes publicly, to know what we should keep doing in our lives and our work, and what we should celebrate. But Jesus is pointing to the temptation to secure our lives over others. And he's pretty familiar with this temptation, right? At the very beginning of his ministry, what better time, the devil comes to him, tempting him. He first tempts him to be seen as great by saying, look, I'm just going to give you positional power. I'm just going to have all the kingdoms bow down before you. I'm going to take you up to a hill, show you all the kingdoms, and I'm just going to put you in power positionally. That's the first temptation. Positional power. So that everyone can see you're at the top of the heap. Or he says, since Jesus kind of deflects that one, he says, how about you go to the top of the temple and throw yourself off and let the angels catch you? Well, that's the temptation to show your great connections, your great network. I'll give you a chance now to show how well connected you are. Just throw yourself off, they'll catch you, people will be amazed. And then, of course, the temptation to turn stones into bread. To actually use some kind of sleight of hand, some magic to create awe, which today we might say can happen through technology and innovation. To be regarded as the greatest through contemporary magic, which is technology. All of this is the temptation to substitute power on display for the humbling work of love. That's the temptation. Substitute power on display for the humble work of love. Jesus had to resist all those, because he wanted to show us a way of living, give us a different social imagination that would save us corporately rather than have us destroy one another in this tournament of vainglory. So what does it look like then to apprentice ourselves to Jesus the servant? So just a few weeks ago, we ordained a deacon in this church. And as I mentioned, that is the same word that is mentioned in this passage for servant, diakonos. And it's the very same word, by the way, in other ancient literature that indeed identifies someone who waits on tables. Now, all those in our tradition, the Anglican tradition, who aspire to be priests have to first become deacons. And why is that? Because they need to learn what it means to serve, to show themselves able to be one whose greatest desire is to serve, because that will need to be part of their core identity as a priest if they move on to that. I had to become a deacon first. So what was my calling as a deacon that still remains with me as a priest? Well, I think we can actually return to this metaphor of the waiter or waitress, and I'm helped by Bishop Barron, if you know him, for this insight. So like a waiter, I, as your servant priest, I'm charged with feeding. I'm charged with feeding you. Feeding the sheep, which is the very words, of course, Jesus used to commission Peter. Feed my sheep. I'm, in fact, both waiter and kind of cook, right? I kind of cook up various things for you, of course, with the help of like 50 volunteers among you. I remember being at the Waffle House. Anybody been to the Waffle House? It's mostly in the South and East. And I had never been there before the first time I visited. And you sit at a counter, at least the one I was at, just had a counter, no tables. And in this case, a waitress took my order. And to my surprise, she turned around and then cooked it on the skillet right behind her. Well, that's kind of like, what a priest does. He feeds. That's what a servant does, a deacon as well. So the first thing a servant does is looks around and says, who is hungry in any sense of the word? Who needs to be nourished? Who needs to be fed? And of course, I mean this in a very broad sense, although it could be very, in fact, quite concrete. The second thing that a waiter or waitress does is listens. Because in order to feed people, you have to listen to what their needs and hunger are. Lots of French today for some reason. But in France, when the waitress comes to the table, finally, she says, "Je vous écoute. Je vous écoute." I am listening to you. We might say, I'm all ears. To listen to other people, to really listen, is a kind of hospitality. Frequently an emotional hospitality. And by the way, I think this emotional hospitality is a major feature of this church. It's a major value of this church. You are so emotionally hospitable to one another. Many of you have said you can just come and kind of be who you are today among us. That's emotional hospitality. That's what listening is. And not just listening to us here. An explicit charge to the deacon, when you read descriptions of an Anglican deacon, is that he or she listens to the needs of the world and communicates them to the church. What the deacon does is helps us know what the world needs and communicates that to us so we can reach back out and meet those needs. We say, in effect, nous vous écoutons. We are listening to you. We are listening to you. To live as servant is to feed others. It's to nurture life. And in order to do that, a servant needs to listen. But third, I would also say the servant has to also discern. See, we are not slaves when it comes to others. We are servants. No, the servant, in order to truly nurture another, has to discern if what is being asked for or ordered, if you will, in fact will really bring this person life. Will it really nurture them, what they say they want? I was in an Italian restaurant, again, what am I doing? International this morning. I remember being in an Italian restaurant in Italy, and I ordered fish in a kind of red sauce. And then I turned to the waiter and said, could I have some Parmesan cheese? My waiter then said, in this country, we do not eat cheese with fish. Now, that was a little more surly than I liked. But he was trying to feed me properly and had to correct my notion of what I thought that was. Sometimes serving others means helping them see what really gives life. Discerning with them what brings life. That's what a spiritual director is. Discerns with you what really God's offer of life is to you. As I often say, we need to help people discern the thing below the thing. We have these cravings, we have the desires, we have these appetites, we have these needs, and what we need to discern is there a thing below the thing that we really need? That's what a servant helps those whom he or she serves identify. What is really needed here? And for the sake of time, I'll just identify one more characteristic of the servant, taken again from the realm of table waiting, and that the servant helps clean up. Humans make messes. They knock things over. They leak onto others. And they do so sometimes recklessly and with great damage. If you've ever spilled something at a restaurant, it's likely that one of the staff rushes over with a towel to help you clean it up. That is the role of a servant, to help someone clean up unhealthy patterns, help them clean up broken relationships, help them forgive and receive forgiveness. As servants, we help one another clean things up. And with that image of a table waiter and a towel in mind, of course, we cannot but think of Jesus on the night he was betrayed, as in a moment we'll celebrate, having prepared the room for his disciples, the restaurant, if you will, having laid the table with food, having fed them, he took up a towel and he cleaned them up. He washed their feet. This is my life. This is your life. And we do this for one another. This is the beautiful life. Even amid the messes, feeding one another, listening to one another, discerning with one another, and helping each other clean up the messes we make. And we are doing this with Jesus. And you might say, where is the gratification when this is hard? And it is exactly that. It is, we get to do this with Jesus. It is the eternal friendship with Jesus in service that is our reward. The reward for following Jesus is Jesus. Now, this is not to give you all something more to do. I speak to parents here who already are servants of their children. I speak to those of you at work who are already serving your colleagues and your industries. I speak to you as spouses who are already serving your husbands and wives. I speak to all of you, many of you in very kind of obvious helping professions, whether professionally or volunteered, who are serving others. We do so in all walks of life. You're already doing it. What Jesus wants for you is to free you from the tyranny of seeking to be the greatest in order to be seen over others, and to replace the desire for superiority, which just results in a kind of loneliness, with the fellowship of serving with Jesus. And I want to say one more thing. Some of you at this point in your life are extremely weary. You don't have much margin. You don't have much capacity. There could be some kind of condition you're suffering from right now. Maybe you need to serve others by letting them serve you, as Jesus often did in his ministry. There are periods in our life where our capacity to serve anyone else but our tightest circle is just difficult. But that's enough. The great 17th century English poet John Milton, whom you may have read parts of Paradise Lost, willingly or unwillingly. I'm going to ask Thomas to put it up. Not Paradise Lost here, but his sonnet 29. At this point, Milton was about 44 years old, and he had gone blind. And so he begins, "When I consider how my life is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless. He says, I look back on my recent life and I think of all the time I've spent serving previously, ere half my days. But now, being blind, he can no longer write as easily. He feels like his talent to serve others has become useless. And he wonders, is God disappointed with me? Does God exact day labor light denied? Light denied in his blindness. Does God still expect me to serve as I once was able to? He asks this. But patience to prevent that murmur that God is a slave driver soon replies, God does not need either man's work or his gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. It's a mild yoke, and here, of course, we hear the echo of Jesus. Come to me, all who are weary. Some of you are weary, and some of you are already heavy laden. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for I am gentle and kind. God is not angry with Milton's weakness. It is not like we are failing God if we are in a season of recovery or rest or great limitation. No, there are others that God can call upon. He is kingly. Thousands at his bidding can speed and post or travel over land and ocean without rest. God can use many people. If you are in a period today of just weariness, of needing to receive. Indeed, Milton concludes by saying, you also serve who only stand and wait. Stand and receive. In humility, allowing others to serve you. So present yourself to Jesus this day, in friendship with him who is the servant, giving, serving, listening, feeding. But some of you need to receive. And that is what creates the body of Christ, the kingdom of God among us. Just in the quiet for a moment. Just say, Lord, I present myself to you for whatever service or receiving you invite me to. Amen.